My name is Avery Sinclair, and I am 26 years old. I never imagined the breaking point would arrive in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, delivered in the quiet of a home office instead of a conference room. The gated hills compound in Woodside sat behind tall iron gates and security cameras, the kind of place that made every visitor feel watched. I had driven through those gates dozens of times before, but that afternoon the air felt heavier the moment I stepped out of my car. If you have ever been handed a single piece of paper and told that signing it was the only way to keep the life you had built, then you already know the particular silence that follows. I felt it settle over me the second I walked into the room. My boss, Eleanor Voss, sat behind a wide desk of dark walnut that faced the hills through floor-to-ceiling glass. She wore a charcoal suit and the same expression she used in every meeting, calm, measured, impossible to read. My husband, Lucas, stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, not quite meeting my eyes. The HR manager, Samantha Reed, stood to Eleanor's right, holding a thin stack of documents in a cream folder. Eleanor did not offer me a seat. She simply gestured to the single chair placed directly in front of the desk. "We need to resolve this today," she said. Her voice carried the same even tone she used when discussing quarterly targets. "The Family Trust requires that all active project leads be formally assigned to the corporate entity. You have been working on the Horizon file outside those lines. Sign the reassignment, and we move forward. Refuse, and we treat it as a breach." I remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. I looked at the folder Samantha held out. The top page showed the company letterhead and a line for my signature. Below it, dense paragraphs I had not seen before. "I was not aware the Horizon file had been moved under the trust," I said. My voice stayed level. The original scope was approved under my personal consulting arrangement. Samantha stepped forward and placed the folder on the desk. The trust language was updated last quarter. "All intellectual property and client relationships developed during employment revert to the company. Your father-in-law's original documents made that clear." I noted the way she said "your father-in-law's original documents," as if the words themselves carried weight I was supposed to accept without question. I reached for the folder, opened it, and scanned the first page. The language was precise and cold. It stated that any work product contacts or analytical methods I had developed while employed would be transferred immediately upon signature. A second clause required me to acknowledge that any prior personal claims were waived. Lucas shifted by the window. "It's just paperwork, Avery. Everyone signs these when they join a family business. It protects the company." I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the page. One sentence near the bottom caught my attention, a reference to prior verbal agreements being superseded by this notarized instrument. I had never signed anything that referenced verbal agreements. Eleanor watched me read. "The trust is not negotiable. Your father-in-law set it up to keep everything inside the family structure. You either align with it, or you step away from the work entirely." I closed the folder and set it back on the desk. "I would like a copy of the full trust document and any amendments made since Theodore's passing." Samantha's mouth tightened slightly at the corners. "We can provide a redacted version after you sign. Full disclosure happens once the reassignment is complete. I am not signing anything today," I said. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the next part of the ultimatum, as if she were reading from a prepared script. "If you do not sign by close of business tomorrow, your access to all company systems will be revoked. Your consulting arrangement will be terminated for cause. We will also notify the clients on the Horizon file that you are no longer authorized to represent the firm." Samantha has already prepared the communications. I looked at Samantha. She met my gaze without blinking. There was no apology in her expression, only the practiced neutrality of someone who had done this before. Lucas finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Mom is trying to protect what Dad built. If you fight this, it gets ugly for everyone." I turned my head toward him. "I am not fighting anything yet. I am asking for the documents that supposedly justify the demand. Eleanor stood. The meeting was over. You have until tomorrow at 5. Use the time to think about what your continued involvement is worth to you and to this family. I picked up the folder because leaving it behind would have looked like surrender. I walked out of the office down the long hallway, lined with framed photographs of the Voss family, and out through the front doors into the late afternoon light. The gate opened automatically as I approached. I drove down the winding road, away from the compound, without looking back. That night, I sat at the kitchen table in the small house Lucas and I rented 20 minutes from the compound. The folder lay unopened in front of me. I did not call anyone. I did not cry or pace or draft angry emails. I simply opened my laptop and began pulling the old emails and calendar notes from the weeks before Theodore Voss's death. He had asked to speak with me alone 2 days before he passed. We had sat in the same home office I had just left. His voice had been thin but clear. He told me the trust he had created was never meant to be a cage. He said Eleanor had already tried to change the distribution language once, and that I should never sign anything that referenced prior verbal agreements without reading every amendment. He had made me promise to keep that conversation between us. At the time, I thought he was protecting the company. Now I understood he had been protecting me from the very document sitting on my table. I closed the laptop. The house was quiet. Lucas had not come home yet. I picked up my phone and sent a single message to Nadia Patel, the senior colleague who had first flagged the irregularities in the Horizon file months earlier. Can we talk tomorrow morning? Off-site? She replied within minutes. Coffee shop, on the corner of Woodside Road. 9. I set the phone down and looked at the folder again. The ultimatum had been clear. What they had not expected was that I would treat it as the starting point rather than the ending. The next morning, I drove to the coffee shop on Woodside Road. Nadia Patel was already at a corner table with her laptop open and a second cup of coffee waiting. She did not ask why I wanted to meet off-site. She simply turned the screen toward me when I sat down. I pulled the version history on the Horizon file and the trust amendments from the last 18 months, she said. Her voice stayed low. The changes started 2 weeks after Theodore died. The clause about prior verbal agreements was inserted in a document that was never circulated for signature. The metadata shows it was edited by Samantha Reed's account at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday. I studied the highlighted sections. One line in the original trust had stated that any work product developed by a beneficiary's spouse would remain under separate personal claim unless explicitly reassigned. The edited version removed the spouse reference entirely and added language that funneled everything into a single corporate trust controlled by the executive committee, Eleanor, and 2 outside directors she had appointed after Theodore's death. Nadia scrolled further. There are 3 wire transfers from the Horizon Project account to an entity called Voss Legacy Holdings. The transfers are labeled as administrative reallocations. The receiving account was opened 6 weeks after Theodore passed. Samantha Reed is listed as the sole signatory on the formation documents. I kept my hands still on the table. Did you find any record of Theodore approving those transfers? No. The approval logs show Eleanor's digital signature on the day the first transfer cleared. The second and third were approved by Samantha under an emergency delegation clause that was also added after Theodore died. I thought of the afternoon Theodore had called me into the office alone. He had been propped against Pillow's oxygen line running across his chest. He told me the trust was meant to give the next generation room to operate without constant oversight. He said Eleanor had already asked him twice to tighten the language around spousal claims. He had refused both times, Then he looked at me and said, if anyone ever puts a document in front of you that talks about verbal agreements, read every page twice. I never agreed to anything that erased your name. I had assumed he was speaking generally about family business. Now the words sat differently. Nadia closed the laptop partway. I can keep digging if you want, but if they find out I pull these logs, they'll lock me out too. I understand, I said. Send me the raw files. I'll handle the rest. She nodded once and slid a small USB drive across the table. This is everything I have so far. Be careful. Samantha has been asking people in compliance about your access patterns for the last 2 weeks. I took the drive, slipped it into my bag, and stood. Thank you. Nadia looked up at me. Whatever they're doing with that trust, it started the moment Theodore couldn't object anymore. I drove back toward the house without turning on the radio. The gated compound was visible in the rearview mirror for a few seconds before the road curved. I did not feel anger. I felt the same precise focus I used when auditing a set of books that did not add up. When I reached the rental house, Lucas's car was in the driveway. He was in the kitchen, still in the shirt he had worn to the compound the day before. He looked up when I came in. You met with Nadia, he said. It was not a question. I did. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mom called this morning. She said if you involve anyone else from the company, they'll treat it as a violation of the confidentiality clause in your consulting agreement. I set my bag on the counter and looked at him. Did she also tell you that the confidentiality clause was added after your father died, and that the original trust-protected spousal work product... Lucas's shoulders tightened. That's not how she explained it. How did she explain it? He hesitated. She said you were trying to take assets that belonged to the family. She said Dad would have wanted everything kept together. I opened the folder from the day before and laid the first page on the counter between us. This document claims to supersede prior verbal agreements. Your father told me directly that he never made any verbal agreement that removed my name from claims I developed. The version history Nadia pulled shows the clause was inserted by Samantha Reed after midnight on a Sunday, weeks after your father was gone. Lucas stared at the page. He did not reach for it. Even if that's true fighting, it will destroy what's left of the family. Mom built half of this company. She's not going to let one file go without a fight. I folded the page and put it back in the folder. I am not asking her to let anything go. I am asking for the documents that actually govern what I signed when I started working there. My phone vibrated on the counter. The screen showed Samantha Reed's name. I answered on speaker. Avery, she said, her tone was brisk. Eleanor has moved the deadline. You need to sign and return the reassignment by 3 this afternoon. If it is not on her desk by then, your system access will be terminated at 4, and we will begin the client notification process. I waited a beat before answering. I will need until close of business tomorrow, as originally stated. That is no longer an option. The board has been briefed. They consider any further delay a material risk. I looked at Lucas. He was watching the phone as if it might explode. I will let you know my decision by 3, I said, and ended the call. Lucas exhaled. Just sign it, Avery. We can figure out the rest later. If you lose the consulting income, we're both in trouble. I picked up the folder and the USB drive. I am not signing anything until I have the complete unredacted trust and every amendment that was made after Theodore died. If that makes me a risk to the board, then the board can explain why they are enforcing a document that was altered without the founder's knowledge. I walked past him into the small office at the back of the house and closed the door. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop and began comparing the files Nadia had given me against the version Eleanor had presented. One page in particular stood out a notarized scan Of the original trust signature page, dated 3 years earlier, Theodore's signature was there clear and steady. The version Eleanor wanted me to sign referenced a different notarized page that did not exist in the original file. I saved both versions side by side and stared at the screen. The discrepancy was not subtle. It was the kind of difference that, once documented, could not be explained away as a clerical error. My phone lit up again. This time it was a text from Benjamin Torres, the corporate counsel who had handled Theodore's estate paperwork. The message was short. "We need to talk." Not on company systems. I replied with the address of the same coffee shop and a time 2 hours from now. Then I sat back in the chair and waited for the next move. I did not have to wait long. At 2:17 p.m., an email arrived from Samantha Reed with the subject line, "Final Notice, Reassignment." The body stated that my consulting agreement was terminated effective immediately for failure to execute required documentation. All access had already been revoked. A separate paragraph informed me that any further contact with company personnel regarding internal matters would be treated as interference. I read it once, then closed the laptop. The quiet in the house felt different now. Not empty, simply cleared of the last pretense that this had ever been negotiable. 2 hours later, I sat across from Benjamin Torres at the same corner table. He was in his late 40s, the kind of corporate counsel who spoke in complete sentences and never raised his voice, even when the evidence in front of him was damning. I slid the USB drive and the folder across the table without preamble. He read in silence for 20 minutes. When he looked up, his expression had not changed, but his pen moved steadily across a yellow legal pad. "The original notarized trust page you have is valid," he said. "The version your mother-in-law presented contains an amendment that was executed without the required beneficiary notice and without Theodore Voss's signature. The metadata on the digital file confirms it was altered after his death. That makes the reassignment document they wanted you to sign legally defective on its face." I nodded once. "What are the practical options?" Benjamin closed the folder. "You can file a quiet title action to correct the trust record based on the original notarized instrument. It would redirect the Horizon Project claims and any associated funds back to the distribution schedule Theodore originally set. Because the alteration was never properly noticed to you as a beneficiary, the court would likely grant the correction without a full trial. The process is mostly paperwork." I considered the word quiet. It fit. I had no interest in public spectacle or long legal battles that would keep me tethered to the Voss name for years. "I want the correction filed," I said, "and I want a clean separation. No ongoing consulting arrangement, no future claims, no contact." Benjamin made another note. "We can structure the filing as an administrative correction rather than an adversarial suit. Your mother-in-law and the HR manager will receive notice, but they will have limited grounds to contest once the original notarized page is entered into the record. The financial trail your colleague uncovered will support the filing if they push back." I stood. "Send me the documents to review tonight. I will sign what needs signing." He rose with me. "One more thing. Once this is filed, the social and professional circle around the compound will almost certainly close ranks. People who attended the same events and sat on the same boards will choose the version of the story that protects their own positions. Some of your existing relationships may not survive the correction." "I understand," I said. And I did. The isolation was not a surprise. It was simply the price of refusing to pretend anymore. That evening, I reviewed the papers Benjamin prepared. The language was precise and narrow, a request to correct the trust record to match the original notarized instrument, dated 3 years earlier. It did not accuse anyone of fraud. It simply restored what Theodore Voss had actually signed. I signed where he indicated and sent the file back. The next morning, the quiet redirection began. Benjamin filed the correction electronically. Within 48 hours, the Horizon Project claims and the associated funds were reallocated according to the original schedule. A portion that had been moved into the post-death entity returned to the distribution that included my name. Eleanor and Samantha received formal notice through their counsel. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no shattered plates. There was only the steady movement of documents through the system and the slow realization on their side that the leverage they had tried to manufacture no longer existed. I did not wait for their response. I drafted a single email to Eleanor and Samantha CCing Benjamin. It stated that I accepted the termination of the consulting arrangement, effective immediately, that I would not pursue further claims beyond the administrative correction already filed, and that I requested no further contact from any member of the Voss family or their representatives. I blocked their numbers and the company email domain before I sent it. Lucas came home that night to find 2 suitcases by the door. He stood in the hallway for a long moment before he spoke. "You're leaving?" he said. "I am." He looked at the suitcases, then at me. "Mom said if you did this, the family would have no choice but to treat you as an outsider. She said some of our friends already think you've been difficult for months." I picked up 1 suitcase. Then the friends who believed that version were never really mine to begin with. He did not argue. He simply stepped aside so I could pass. At the door I turned once. "I released the guilt a long time ago," I said. "I just needed the paperwork to catch up." I drove to a furnished apartment I had rented 2 towns over. The lease was month to month. The furniture was neutral and unfamiliar. I unpacked the 2 suitcases, set my laptop on the small desk, and opened the file Benjamin had sent, confirming the trust correction had been recorded. The Horizon funds that had been quietly moved were now listed under the original distribution. It was not a fortune. It was simply what had always been mine on paper. I closed the file and did not open it again. In the weeks that followed, the social circle around the compound did exactly what Benjamin had predicted. Invitations to events stopped arriving. Mutual friends who had once included both of us in group texts went silent, or replied with short, careful messages that avoided any mention of the Voss family. One former colleague from the compound sent a single line, "I heard you made things difficult. I hope you find peace somewhere else." I did not reply. The peace I was choosing did not require their understanding. Nadia Patel reached out once off the record. She had been quietly let go 2 weeks after I left with a severance package that included a non-disclosure agreement. She told me she had already started interviewing at other firms and that she would forward any relevant opportunities if I wanted them. I thanked her and wished her well. I did not ask her to keep in touch. The isolation settled in layers. Some days it felt like relief, the absence of the constant low-grade tension that had accompanied every interaction with my mother-in-law and the HR manager. Other days it felt like the precise weight of having chosen myself over the pretense that we were still a family. I did not try to fill the space with new connections. Immediately, I worked on small consulting projects that had nothing to do with the Voss name. I walked in the mornings. I answered only the calls that mattered. One afternoon, 3 months after the correction was filed, I received a letter from Eleanor's personal attorney. It was short and formal. It stated that the family had decided not to contest the administrative correction and that all further matters would be handled through counsel only. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the altered documents, no request for reconciliation. I read it once, filed it with the other paperwork, and did not respond. I had spent years carrying the quiet belief that if I worked hard enough and stayed silent enough, I would eventually belong inside the Voss structure. Releasing that belief did not feel like victory. It felt like the end of a long-held debt I had never actually owed. The guilt I had carried for not being the daughter-in-law they wanted dissolved the moment I stopped trying to earn a place that had never been offered on honest terms. I am still 26, the apartment is still small, and the furniture is still neutral. Some mornings I wake up, and the silence in the room feels complete. On those mornings, I make coffee, open my laptop to work that is entirely my own, and remember that the breaking point was never the ultimatum itself. It was the moment I chose to treat the ultimatum as information rather than a command. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace with people who only valued your silence and choosing the version of your life that no longer required their approval, what was your breaking point